Great to be here with all of you.
We are going to talk about Julian's wonderful book, but we sort of also conceived of this as a chance to talk about the current moment in U.S. China relations and what's going on in China, and then, in some ways how they connect to some of the material in Julian's wonderful book. We called this event Shifting Terrain in U.S. China relations, and I think particularly over the last few days that the kind of seismic metaphor seems pretty apt. But part of what makes me really happy to be talking to you tonight is that you've not only been in the thick of U.S. China policy at the State Department and in the White House over the past 4 years, but you are also, as Jing says, a historian and someone who can help us think through, from that vantage point, some of the more enduring structures and forces that are shaping Chinese politics and society at the moment. You're also a poet of extraordinary subtlety, and your debut book of poems, which I think we also have for sale at the back of the room, it also explores kind of currents and tensions between China and the world outside of it. And while the kind of professional combo of policymaker, historian, poet was kind of the norm for centuries of people involved in the affairs of state in imperial China, it's pretty rare in Washington today. And I think it gives Julian a set of interpretive tools and a sensibility that are also quite rare, and that all of us admire deeply and rely upon. So
thank you.
It's good to be talking to you at such a crazy moment. And I think it's sort of tempting to start by asking you about right now, but I thought it would be kind of better, before getting into what's been upended, to just get a kind of baseline sense of the lay of the land. So I thought we could just back up a few years. You played a significant role in the fashioning of China policy for the Biden administration, from the campaign through the transition, through implementation at the State Department and the NSC, ending as senior director for China and Taiwan on the National Security Council. And I just wonder if you could begin by kind of telling us how you assessed that trajectory. What were you, what assumptions did you have going into it that held true? What changed? What were your goals? What changed over those 4 years?
Great.
Let's start there.
Sure. Well, thank you, Susie. And it's really wonderful to be here at the Asia Society, which has been an important institution in my own life, not just publishing in ChinaFile and enjoying the other riches of the institution, but also this community that you've assembled here. So thanks for having me. And thanks to you all for coming out today and enjoying the last hours of a beautiful spring day indoors. So to the question that you asked, I think it might be helpful to start with a few of what I think for many of us who worked in the Biden administration and across the U.S. government, I don't think this is a terribly partisan set of ideas, saw when we looked at the world in January 2021, and particularly when we looked at China. There was, I think, a clear sense that the United States and China are in a protracted international rivalry, a competition. That's what we mean when we talk about competition. That both countries were going to be mobilizing all elements of national power to this competition in a multiplicity of ways. Their economies were, both in a challenging position because of COVID, and I think both felt that was going to be a real priority, the domestic economy in the period ahead, but obviously also technological, military, diplomatic competition were going to be top of mind. The competitive dynamic isn't the only dynamic in U.S.-China relations, of course. There's also significant strain of interdependence due to the interconnections between the two economies. We acknowledged that, and that was something we felt we had to figure out how to address. There are cooperative elements, elements where the United States and China are working together, need to work together. And then there are more directly confrontational elements, elements where it's hard to imagine the United States and China ever seeing eye to eye. So for the Biden administration, that led to the development of a strategy that we talked about in a pretty simple tagline, had 3 parts: invest, align, and compete. And what that means, just in brief, is the core of this competition was actually going to be which country was better able to mobilize domestically the sources of its strength, not because of the other, but because it was going to be trying to create the greatest amount of prosperity, the best life for its people, the strongest political system, and so on. And so investments that we made, we saw very much, whether it's in semiconductors or in clean energy technology, in that vein. And then second, and critically, that we, the United States, had a few really asymmetric advantages vis-a-vis China, but none compares to our network of allies and partners around the world. The relationships that we have, which are the envy of China and of the world, and that we were going to really focus on intensifying those relationships, rebuilding those relationships, and using them to ensure that we were in the strongest possible competitive position, harnessing those 2 assets, our domestic strengths and our international partnerships, to put the United States in the strongest possible position in this long-term, open-ended competition with China. So that was our approach, which is now actually sort of me talking with my historian hat on. I have to be candid and say that we're now in a very different moment. We'll talk about that in some detail. But I also want to just talk about one other dimension of the Biden administration approach, which I think is an important one. We saw this competition playing out very intensely and not with any great confidence that it was going to be able to stay just as a competition. The risk of conflict is there. I don't think either side particularly wants it. Certainly it's not in either side's interest for competition to veer into conflict. And so we were very focused on using diplomacy with Beijing to manage that competition, to put guardrails around that competition, not with the belief that we would somehow come up with some great eternal accommodation. That's not a reasonable or candidly shouldn't necessarily be the way we approach our diplomacy, I think, but with the idea that we could usefully prevent competition from veering into conflict. And I think, candidly, the record is pretty good on that score, that is possible. And before the Biden administration, I don't think we had seen it done in a period of competition. So that's something to be proud of, I think.
How would you characterize the way that this relationship looked over roughly the same period from the Chinese side, based on your interactions with Chinese diplomats, your analysis?
So, I think going into the beginning of the sort of 2021 period, Beijing's view was that it was going to sort of take a somewhat absolutist position, that the United States could not compete and conduct diplomacy with China, there was going to have to be a different way of thinking about it. Some people at the time talked about, quote unquote, resetting U.S. China relations. I don't think that was something that was seriously considered in Beijing as something that would be in the U.S. interest. I think that was something where it was more, let's go in with that kind of posture. And I think
I think that was a posture, like at the beginning when they said, oh, we're just going to go back to Obama-era policy. It seemed really strange given what all the people that were entering the administration had been writing and saying over those.
That's right. And, you had, as you say, one of the wonderful things about the vibrant democracy that we live in is that people who end up serving in government write a lot, and their views are often out there. They talk to reporters. They do events like this, and so there was, I don't think, any serious America's analyst in Beijing. There are those people. I don't think any of them expected that to happen. But in diplomacy, one often asks for things that you don't necessarily expect to happen. There are many reasons you can imagine why that would be. I think over the course of 4 years, a couple things happened that were that shaped the way Beijing saw the United States. One is that I do think the Biden administration had significant success in building those coalitions, those partnerships, those networks of allies and partners in a way that increased pressure on Beijing and that Beijing felt. There's
to do what? Pressure.
Yeah. So this is a really, I mean, it's honestly a very wide gamut, ranging from coordinating our diplomacy with Beijing, meaning making sure that we're sending similar messages on priorities, whether it's the importance of cross-strait peace and stability and not taking precipitous action toward Taiwan, or taking economic and technological defensive measures designed to protect our economies from, for instance, oversupply, overcapacity coming out of China, a range of different issues, taking, for instance, coordinated sanctions to address human rights abuses in Xinjiang. And I think in all of these areas, Beijing, as I said a moment ago, sees U.S. alliances as a source of strength and seeks to find areas of division or areas of difference. And candidly, we can talk about this a little bit, but to exacerbate those where they exist, and I think felt a tremendous amount of pressure from the effective coordination that happened there. So that's one. I think second, Beijing did come to realize that some of its economic challenges were more serious than initially perhaps had been acknowledged, and that's not something that I think you'll see Chinese leaders talk a tremendous amount about, but we do have indications, even as recently as the just concluded meetings in Beijing, that they are acknowledging this in a more head-on way, and we'll have to talk more about that. And then third, I think in a more tacit sense, Beijing acknowledged that there were going to be competitive dynamics at the center of U.S.-China relations, and that therefore it was in their interest too to use diplomacy to manage this competition and to prevent it from veering into conflict. And I think you're never going to see Chinese officials, or you probably won't see Chinese officials go on the record and use that kind of language, but I do think you saw a degree of willingness to engage in that kind of activity develop over the course of that time.
And how much, let's just focus a little bit on China's domestic politics during that moment. I mean, how did you see the relationship with the U.S. Fitting into Xi Jinping's vision for the country, what he hoped to accomplish during this period? There was COVID, there was all these things, and there were, a series of domestic policies that really rolled back some of the liberalization that you explored in your book in the 1980s in the space of the legal system, history, expression, civil society. So talk a little bit about that, and to what extent any of that has to do with the U.S. or is sort of a separate dynamic.
Yeah. Fascinating and candidly quite hotly debated question among China analysts. I think the basic view that I think most people would agree with is that the United States looms extremely large in Beijing's domestic and international policymaking. That there is a focus domestically on competition with the United States, developing technological capabilities in particular that can catch up or even surpass technological capabilities here. And there is a real sense that China's national rejuvenation, as the Communist Party calls it, is something that we're now in a world where it exists in some degree of tension with the United States. I think a sharper-edged version of that point would be to say that some in China see the United States as an obstacle to the achievement of that national rejuvenation. And then internationally, I think this is a more debated question, but fundamentally, some of Beijing's core objectives in Asia to have more of a sphere of influence, much greater freedom of action, much greater ability to get their way with core U.S. allies and partners, Japan, Korea, the Philippines, that there is a real competition for influence and a real sense that the United States could constrain Beijing's ambitions. And I would say from my perspective, the United States approach in Asia is fundamentally about ensuring that no power has a closed or exclusive sphere of influence, but obviously Beijing sees it differently. I do think in the past few years, you've seen a few key trends in China that are important for everybody to pay attention to, and I think that are important for how they approach this period we are now in with the Trump administration. The one, first is a real effort to harden the Chinese economy for a period of more intense international struggle. The German sinologist Miko Hotari calls this Fortress China. The idea essentially is creating supply chains that are indigenized so that they don't rely on long-distance shipping or trade across the world that could be disrupted in any number of scenarios short of conflict. A real focus on stockpiling, having massive grain and petroleum and other stores domestically that can be used. And sort of redundancy across supply chains in China. Now, this is the kind of...
Because of a sense of danger?
Because of a sense that this is, I would say, a view that this is what responsible governance looks like in a system where, as maybe we can get to soon, the history of the past 50 years is a history that is built around simultaneously greater opening to the world and profound anxiety and insecurity about how that opening to the world will undermine the Chinese Communist Party and its rule and fracture the national project that it believes itself to be embarking on. But then a second really important trend, which I think folks know about, but needs to be kept in mind, is a real political hardening of the Chinese body politic. One thing that I remember being asked at events even before the pandemic is, Xi Jinping has been doing this anti-corruption campaign for so long, like surely it's gonna wrap up sometime soon. And the reality is, of course, that this is a permanent state of being. This is a permanent state of governance because it is centrally a part of an effort to impose a kind of political discipline, uniformity, patriotism, nationalism, and party loyalty across the system and out into society. And that has only intensified also in the
actually,
period.
our colleague, the political scientist Wu Guoguang, who himself was involved in the history that you write about in your book as an aide to General Secretary Zhao Ziyang, just recently wrote a paper for us about why is Xi Jinping continuing to purge after purge after purge of the leadership, and to the point that now he's not purging. He's purging allies and presumably purging people that he promoted himself. And that it is sort of partly about the things that you just talked about, but also a way of managing the fallout from governance failures that are maybe the side effects of overly concentrated power, basically.
Yeah, totally.
And so he's making errors, and the way to kind of deflect blame and keep the leadership in line is to just keep doing these purges.
Yeah, which, is not unique to Chinese politics.
No.
But I do think when we consider the way in which the Chinese leadership sees the world today, the two areas that I just focused on, the economic development and hardening, meaning trying to grow the economy, but also to do so in a way that is secure, and the political security effort underway are where they start, and then foreign relations build on top of that, but those are foundational.
And I think now would be a nice time to talk about your book a little bit. I mean, does having explored so deeply the history of the 1980s, this moment of experimentation, liberalization of the economy, of the political system, that one of Xi Jinping's projects has been to sort of continue the suppression and erasure of the history of that period, as part of this campaign against what he calls historical nihilism.
Yes.
How does having really delved into that period shape your view of some of these dynamics and where this sense of peril comes from?
Yeah. I think when it's a layered question, I want to answer it in a layered way, because when you're a historian, you are writing your history for its own sake. This is a project of excavation and discovery, and the book, Never Turn Back, is really a book about China in the 1980s. It is an exploration, as you said, of this extremely open-ended period where the Chinese economy was developing in a quite rapidly and sometimes quite scattershot way, where new technologies were being introduced, new ideas were being introduced constantly. There were vogues for a really wide range of ideas, from Russian novels that were a century old to the most cutting edge, U.S. popular thinkers. One of the folks I write about in the book is Alvin Toffler, who some in this audience may recall. I admit he was new to me, but his book, The Third Wave, was this futurist manifesto about the information technology revolution that was coming and became very popular in China in that period. But then that all came to an end. That period of openness came to an end around the Tiananmen crackdown. It was never something that was just permitted to flourish entirely. It was always contested. There were periods during the 1980s of repression of that. So I wanted, first and foremost, to do justice to that history, which is not as well known as it should be, but is an extraordinary story to investigate and to bring to light. But the fact that it came to an end and how it came to an end, I think, is a direct way of seeing how Xi Jinping develops the views that he develops and how the Chinese system, political system, develops in the way that it does today. Because to my mind, many of the core ideas that animate Xi Jinping and the decisions that he has made in his time in power come out of not that period of vibrancy in the 1980s that I was just talking about, but out of a period of a few years that is often skipped over in histories of modern China, which is between June 4th, 1989, when the Tiananmen crackdown occurs, and when things sort of start up again in 92, let's say. Deng Xiaoping goes on his southern tour, famous event where he tours the south, and people sort of say, we're back, we're off to the races again. But in those 3 years after Tiananmen, there, I show in the book, are a series of decisions made that I do think are direct lineages to the Xi Jinping worldview. There is first a really sort of wholehearted embrace of the fear that there are enemies, both domestic and foreign, seeking to undermine the Chinese Communist Party. That idea throughout the 1980s is present, but is not the only or the preeminent paradigm, and certainly is after that. Second, a real concern articulated in a less shades of gray and a more black and white way about how marketization, the development of market economy, of private enterprise, and of some of the social practices that come with that, could bring real political crisis to China. And then third, and critically, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fact that this is a phenomenon that plays out. Both seems to affirm those views that China escaped in the minds of the CCP leaders at the time, what befell their socialist brothers and sisters in other countries, but also a degree of pride that, as Deng Xiaoping said, that China is, as long as the flag of socialism flies in China, we will not lose this cause in the world. And that idea that China is a socialist survivor in a dangerous capitalist world, I think is a source of many of the impulses that we see from Xi Jinping, even though, of course, the Chinese Communist Party has made its accommodation with market forces a long time ago.
So into this already sort of insecure sensibility about the dangers that the world holds for Xi Jinping's project comes this moment where all of a sudden a kind of predictable, visible landscape of international geopolitical architecture is suddenly being rocked, every few hours. What is your sense of how China's leadership might be thinking about that, how they might exploit it? They're one of the kind of a piece of conventional wisdom over the past several years is that the Chinese system depends on the kind of order that the U.S. has created or helped build, and that the international system has actually benefited China even when it has thwarted some of Beijing's goals. So, how do you think Xi is looking at this changed landscape? A plus or a minus?
Yeah. Well, I think like all of us, I imagine at least that the analysts in Beijing probably have to begin all of their briefings by saying, everything I'm about to tell you could change. I don't know exactly how I would do that if I were briefing up in that system, but at least that attitude has to infuse what I think we'll talk about here. But I think there is I would say on balance, a view that this period could be quite good, could be quite beneficial if handled in a certain way, but that it is fraught with major risks. There's obviously the instability that you described is not something that a system that seeks stability is comfortable with, but there is sort of a baseline view that folks may be familiar with the phrase that Xi Jinping often likes to invoke, which is that the world is undergoing changes unseen in a century, that the international system is changing before our eyes, and that China will benefit from that. A second phrase that used to be more in vogue publicly is now less in vogue publicly, but I don't think has really changed, is the basic assessment of Xi Jinping and others in the Chinese system that the East is rising and the West is declining, as they put it. And you can put those two phrases sort of together, and you get a picture of how one would look at the world even prior to this presidency. I think there are few priorities in the period ahead that you're going to see Beijing continue to embark on. One, I mentioned a moment ago, which is the hardening of the Chinese economy. And I think actions of the sort that happened in the first Trump administration only underscore to them why that's necessary. So that will certainly continue and is already continuing. And similarly, the points about political control becoming all the more important will continue. But I think those are where some of the risks are. I also think economically you'll see continuing efforts to cushion the blows of actions like tariffs. We've seen basically since the election, Beijing roll out a series of policies, stimulus measures. They're holding fire in certain ways, but I think the cushioning factor will continue. But I think they are also very focused on finding opportunities diplomatically. And this is a tremendous area of focus for Beijing right now. What I mean by that is the following. I mentioned a few minutes ago that Beijing sees U.S. alliances and partnerships as a huge source of advantage to the United States and a source of pressure on China that they have felt in recent years. They have seen what an effectively mobilized U.S. alliance system can mean for them. And so I think you are seeing Beijing now embark on, candidly, exactly what one might predict they would do, which is an effort to win back what they perceive to be countries that have gotten too close to the United States. You certainly saw this when Wang Yi, China's foreign minister, went to the Munich Security Conference. We've since seen even sharper language out of Beijing. Their sort of senior Europe diplomat just last week described sort of the Trump administration's pressure on Europe and the transatlantic crisis that we're all living through right now in very harsh language, and said directly to Europeans, you know, you guys have a choice to make and you should choose China, in not so many words. And so I think we're certainly seeing that. Now, candidly, we can talk about Europe more if you'd like. I think there are so many core interests that Europeans share with the United States, but they're obviously in a position right now where Beijing's outstretched hand may be newly appealing. And then also Beijing has embarked on quite an interesting and a somewhat underreported, I think, effort with countries on its periphery that have been at the sort of sharp edge of Beijing's more aggressive diplomacy in the past, but there has been a unmistakable, subtle but unmistakable warming of ties with India, including the resumption of direct flights. There's been diplomacy with Japan and even outreach to the Philippines. Now, it's too early to say what any of this will lead to. Obviously, all of these countries are also trying to get off on a good foot with the new administration in Washington, but you see that Beijing, with U.S. allies, is making a push in that direction. And then I think with much of the global South sees itself as having a kind of, you know, it's open season, so to speak, for Beijing's diplomacy to push without some of the counterforce that we were very focused on thinking about. Just as one small data point here, there have been a few reports, quite interesting, though too early to say if it's a real trend, that as U.S. foreign assistance has been frozen or cut, USAID projects being cut, as folks will have followed in the news, that Chinese diplomats are going to host governments or even just to the NGOs that were being funded and offering to help out. There was one report of this in Cambodia around some demining initiatives, and you've seen other reports of it in the Pacific Islands and in the Western Hemisphere. Now, that's small scale, but it is a sign, I think, that Beijing sees this period as one of opportunity as well.
That's interesting because, of course, their foreign aid budget has always been
right.
very tiny compared to
relative to ours.
Talk a little bit about Russia.
Yeah.
What?
So, you meaning China, Russia, or
U.S. Russia, and how you imagine that
Sure.
being read in Beijing.
So, I guess let me first step back and say, you know, how does Beijing see Russia? What is this relationship, which I think has been the subject of a lot of conversation, but you know, I'll just give you my sense of it. President Xi Jinping and President Vladimir Putin have met over 40 times in their tenures in office. I think they share certain aspects of their worldview. There are differences as well, but both see the United States as an obstacle to the achievement of some of their core aims, and sees the other as a critical, maybe even indispensable partner in the achievement of some of their national objectives, partly because of U.S. pressure. The obvious example of this is that because of the sanctions architecture that was constructed to respond to Russia's war against Ukraine, Russia has needed China across a range of different domains to keep its economy going at the level that they seek, to build out its defense industrial base, which has been a tremendous area of partnership with China. Putin and Xi usually do calls on each other's birthdays. They have described this as an all-weather partnership, so not just on beautiful spring days like today, but when the going gets tough, that they're going to be there for each other. And so I go on a little bit about that because I think it's now a foundational part of each country's grand strategy and view of the world. And so in that context, there's now this idea which has been in circulation, I think sometimes called like a reverse Nixon or reverse Kissinger, the idea that perhaps that some in the current administration talk about, that these can be they can be sort of peeled off from one another, that engagement with Russia could cause sort of that partnership with China to sort of fade in the way that the outreach to China in the late 60s and early 70s peeled China away from the Soviet Union and transformed the balance of power in the late Cold War era. I think this is very unlikely for the reasons that I just described. In a way, I think what worries me the most about this particular dynamic at this moment is, we just talked about the fracturing of U.S.-Europe ties, and so that rather than a situation in which the United States might be splitting apart China and Russia in a way that could be advantageous for our national interests, the likelier path is one in which China-Russia ties remain very strong, but the United States and Europe split or fracture in some way. And that, as I've said now I think a few times, a huge source of our strength, the United States' strength, are these relationships that we can bring to bear on a whole range of national priorities, setting aside competition with China, but fundamentally also critical in that domain. And so I worry about a scenario in which we are close to the achievement of one of both Beijing and Moscow's top objectives, which is to split the United States from our transatlantic alliance. And certainly that would, I think, embolden both Beijing and Moscow in this period. So it does worry me.
And how do you see Beijing's view of Taiwan affected by those dynamics?
So I think
maybe say a bit about what's been happening in Taiwan domestically as well over the past year or so, because I think that's...
Sure. So, Beijing's approach to Taiwan in recent years has been, there's so much in the headlines every day that it doesn't normally get onto the front page, but it's an important story not to lose sight of, that Beijing has continued to turn up the pressure toward Taiwan, to increase military pressure, economic pressure. Beijing is extremely critical of the party in power in Taiwan and of Lai Ching-te. And in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine, we have seen prominent voices from Taiwan speak about the importance of defending Ukraine to show that this kind of aggression cannot stand in the 21st century. Bi Kim Xiao, who is now back in Taipei, when she was in Washington, spoke to this many times. And so even though I don't think these are two situations that we should be too quick to say are similar or the same, or to analogize because they're extremely different. There is this view, I think, that is an important one to take seriously, that a settlement of Russia's invasion of Ukraine that essentially ratified Russia's aggression would send a signal to Beijing that big countries that want to throw their weight around and bully the smaller, and that's something that can stand. And that certainly is not my view. I think it's probably not the view of many people, but I think it is something where there's tremendous concern right now about what may unfold in the coming weeks and months, and the message that Beijing might take from that they perhaps could at some point in the future get away with something similar.
That brings me to a question about sort of policy making bandwidth, as a way of trying to understand how this current administration might even be thinking about a coherent China policy. I mean, you spent part of your time in the most of the time in the Biden administration working on China, and then you spent a year and a half as an advisor to the Deputy National Security Advisor, that was not solely focused on China, but was entirely global. So you saw the decision-making process across crises, across regions, all from your literal closet in the office in the West Wing. And I wonder, given that that was a relatively stable period of policy making, at least compared to the last 50 days. What perspective did you gain on how China stacks up against other crises, and is our policy capable of making long-term strategic decisions when there's so many crises going on at once?
So it's a question that I hope future historians take up when they write about U.S. foreign policy in this period. But I'm not going to dodge it. I just genuinely hope that historians will take this question up, because I think it's something that even just as consumers of news, I think people feel how to keep up with everything going on in all of these different corners of the world. And one of the things that is extraordinary about some of the folks I worked with, particularly the then National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and his Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner, is to see the capacity that certain people can have to do what you just alluded to, which is manage the many crises and exigencies of the day or the week, but also to make sure that you're keeping your eye on the balls that also really matter, but may not come thundering into your inbox on a given day. And so I think the record, I hope, will speak for itself to future historians, both that we continued to take significant actions to strengthen the U.S. position vis-a-vis China throughout a period of multiple wars in multiple regions and many other crises and pressures, and that we continued to make time for the diplomacy with Beijing that can manage competition, as I was talking about, because both of those things are essential. And I think one of the lessons for future U.S. policymakers, and something that I'm just thinking about in my own life now that I have a little more time to reflect on these things, is that it requires you, as someone who's operating in a bureaucracy, to make sure that the system really knows that you're seeing a lot of attention given to this issue, and that's because it's important. This week there's a big crisis that pops up, and of course everybody has to deal with it. But that throughout that we meant what we said, that China is a key priority, and that it's going to take a lot of intensive management to get it right. And I think making sure that you have the structures in place to do that is really important. It's one of the reasons I'm proud of the time that when I was at the State Department, we set up this new office, the Office of China Coordination, to basically make sure that the State Department had a nerve center thinking all the time across all the regions of the world about prioritizing China so that it didn't fall down the priority list. And other parts of the U.S. government have done similar things, and that's one way to keep it going, even in very busy other periods.
I have no idea, but is that even still operational? I mean, we're sort of talking about this as though there is a continuum when it feels like there is maybe just a rupture in all of these processes. Do you feel like that's something we can conclude now or not?
Yeah, I guess what I would say there is certainly a very plausible hypothesis. I don't yet feel that I know on some of these more we're talking about pretty granular questions. I don't know exactly what the verdict will be yet. But I also, it's the right question to ask, and candidly, it's something where I also think everybody, who comes out of government, whatever your stripe or affiliation, has to talk about how we approach these issues now that U.S. government bureaucracy is in the news every day. I think the talking about what government that works well, that gets results, can look like is important to do in a period when people are hearing a lot about the alternative.
A related question, I guess, is, it can be hard, certainly, for private citizens, with so much seeming to change every day, or being announced or attempted, whether or not it actually pans out. It can be, hard to sort of hear the important notes through this cacophony. And I just wonder, are there things as they relate to the U.S. relationship with China that we should be trying to focus on, amid all of the noise? And what are you looking at to try to gain a sense of, where ultimately any of this is going? Is that even possible right now?
I do think it's hard. I think, we are still at a stage in the relationship between the United States and China as this administration will conduct it, where I think some of the fundamental questions have not been answered, or at least if they've been answered, they certainly have not been revealed. And there are clearly different views held by very senior people in this administration on China and on China-related questions. How all of that plays out, I think one of the lessons of the first term of President Trump is that often things will play out in a way where folks are kind of aware as they're playing out. Every administration has leaks and the like, but certainly it's usually when there are big policy debates, unfortunately the case, whatever party, that a lot of that comes out and folks on the outside are able to follow some of it. But I don't think we're there yet, and candidly, I don't think in this early period it seems to have been a top priority to do a range of China-related actions other than the long telegraphed tariffs, which have essentially proceeded as they were described in the campaign, in the transition, but also not in the level of very high-level diplomatic engagement with Beijing. There have obviously been some phone calls and some in-person meetings, but some of the ideas that will be most important to assess when they come out, like the prospect of some sort of broad-ranging negotiation or deal, we just have not yet seen that be apparently prioritized. And there's a lot going on in the world, so I actually don't even necessarily mean that as a criticism, but to your question, that does make it quite challenging, I think, at this point, to speak of a China policy, let alone a China strategy. But I promise to keep you all posted. When I
have you
see
back.
one, I'll let you know.
Okay. I think I just have one more question, and then we can open it up to all of you. And this is kind of more personal and relates back to what I was saying at the beginning about your unusual sort of professional combo. But another thing that is rare about you among senior officials making China policy, at least in the Biden administration, probably also in this current administration, is that you spent a lot of time in China and with Chinese people. When I first met you more than 20 years ago, you were organizing, youth summits with meetings between U.S. and Chinese high school students. You spent time interning at Caijing, which was at the time the leading news magazine in China. And I just wonder, you've got close friendships, you write poems about people in China. How does that, do you have a sense of how that shapes your sensibility as an analyst and as a policymaker? Does it matter to have spent that kind of time in China? Because we're entering a period where it's almost impossible to think about people following a similar trajectory. Of course, there's only one Julian Gewirtz, but I mean, it's pretty difficult for young Americans interested in China to spend open-ended time in China.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you think that matters and how it's mattered to you.
Well, I guess I'd say a couple things. One is, I think in this period of intensified competition between the United States and China, and in this period when China is such a critical national security priority for the United States, it is really important that the U.S. government continue to find ways to bring in people with a deep understanding of the culture, the history, the language. You never want to be in a situation where there's a consequential meeting between, let's say, the U.S. president and the Chinese leader, and there are no Mandarin speakers on the U.S. side other than the interpreter. You want your team, as we were able to have in the Biden administration, to have that depth of understanding. And that's not because I think it's determinative of a particular policy view, but because if you want to deliver a very firm, clear message on Taiwan or on support to Russia, you need to get it right. You need to make it land. You need to make sure that it comes across with the seriousness and firmness and deterrent effect that you want it to. And to continue to understand China's evolving strategies and what they mean for the United States, you need that. You need people with that kind of understanding in the room. Obviously, U.S. history has examples of times when we have lost that capability. In the Cold War and in an earlier period, also of U.S.-China relations. And so I think it's just important to say that, and I think we're doing actually a pretty good job to date, but we need to do a lot better. And then the second thing I would say is, I, on a personal level, have felt that I have seen in the course of my life, as have you, and I'm sure many in this room, an extraordinary transformation in China. When I started going to China in the mid 2000s, 2004, 2005, it really was a very different place than it is now, and that's by design. Meaning, a lot of what Xi Jinping during his time in power has done, which has changed the freewheeling, greater degree of openness, independent journalists who were publishing articles about corruption, criticizing officials, bringing a lot of stuff to light. That has obviously been something he's turned against. When there were a whole range of activists working not as dissidents, but as activists within a system that has quite deliberately been repressed, including folks both of us know well. who are now in jail. And so I think while there is potentially some degree of, a long view with a measure of optimism that can come from understanding the long sweep of history, I also think there is a quite cold reality that one can experience firsthand of a place that changes significantly, and needing to accept that, as a result, you're going to have a different policy as the United States, you're going to have a different relationship individually, and everything in between. And so certainly that's one of, for me, the biggest takeaways from being able to have that range of experiences over the course of my life.
All right, I think we can now open it up to you for questions. If you could just raise your hand if you have a question. I will call on you, and then just wait to receive a microphone before you start to speak. That would be wonderful. Up here, Aaron.
Hi, Aaron Glasserman, UPenn. Great to see you both. Thanks, this was fantastic. Early on in the Biden administration, there was an article that came out basically describing the China team as a team of rivals. And I wonder if you, given the different priorities in terms of climate, in terms of trade, in terms of security focus, I wonder if you accept that categorization, that description, and if so, what was it like to live that, and how do you think about that applied to the current administration? Thanks.
You want to take a few, or should I just do one?
No, I think
Okay.
one at a time is fine.
Great to see you. That was really not my experience at all. And I'm not questioning that the article was written, but it wasn't, I think candidly people came in with a view that I described. We were talking, at the beginning of our time together, which is a sense that this was going to be an intense competition and that we were going to have to develop policies to reckon with that, but that we also needed to manage the competition responsibly and find, when there are areas for the United States and China to work together, figure out a way to do that. On climate, which is an issue that I worked on in the Obama administration and that I think is existential. It's funny that you need to still say that, but sure. We had very active effort to kind of bring China into conversation on this. When Speaker Pelosi, I think it was, went to Taiwan, Beijing suspended that engagement. And for, I think, many people, that was a clear distillation that, Beijing sometimes sees those kind of engagements as what it perceives as like a source of leverage, give, take, depending on behavior that it does or doesn't like, which is certainly not how we approached it. But I also think you cannot evaluate any, U.S. administration without talking about success or failure on climate issues, and candidly, the Inflation Reduction Act, the investments that we made, I think were, historic and an extraordinary contribution. And I would love, with U.S. China climate dynamics, more than anything, for there to be a kind of race to the top where there is a competitive dynamic that we've been describing, and it causes each country to try to deploy more, to scale faster, to innovate faster. I think that is plausible. I don't think it's where we are right now, but I think it's plausible. And that would be the sort of model that I would hope at some point in the future could be obtained. But for reasons I've just alluded to, I think is going to be tough.
I'd like to ask a question of the poet and the historian, probably the point at which the historian and the poet meet. Henry Kissinger's book on China, the first part of it is, just extraordinary. How did he do it? I don't know. At one point, he says that as he got to know China more and more, he, for someone who had studied communist parties and encountered communist leaders, he said he began to think of China more as a contemporary China, communist society, began to think of it as a Confucian society. I wonder if that, strikes you at all.
Yeah, it's the second time Confucian legacies have come up in an hour, which is probably a record for New York City in 2025. Thanks for the question, in all seriousness. I think when historians analyze the kind of evolution of China as a state, as a polity, as an empire, these layers are all built on top of one another. And I think any analysis of China has to look at those imperial legacies, Confucian system that structured the way in which for many periods of those millennia, the Chinese state was organized, but also has to reckon with the fact that the Communist Revolution in 1949 was in many ways presented as a rejection of that history. And so the interplay there is significant, and one of the reasons why it is interesting at times to see Chinese Communist Party leaders use very explicitly this Confucian legacy, talk about these values, use these words. Occasionally there have been periods where statues of Confucius have popped up in central Beijing, and journalists and analysts have tried to make sense of what this is. And I think Kissinger's core point, as I recall it, in his analysis there, is about a kind of engagement that is required of a state that sees itself in civilizational terms. And I certainly think that's a factor to keep in mind. There was recently a few years ago, very interesting summit of China and many of its more like-minded countries on its periphery in Central Asia that was sort of set in this imperial, I think, Tang Dynasty setting, and had many of the symbols of that particular period of imperial history, which, to just be clear, was a period where many of those countries were in a tributary relationship with Beijing. And I'm not a protocol officer, but it struck me as an unmistakable message about a certain kind of use of history, which has been a theme that we've been talking about today, and one that is not lost, at least on Chinese audiences, even if I did sort of wonder if those other leaders' staffs had told them what this was implicitly kind of saying.
Yes, over there.
Hello, testing. Okay. Hi, my name is Carlisle. I wanted to ask a question about the technology competition. I feel like it's come out quite a bit in this chat. On the competition side, we have education systems that aren't being supported to continue producing leading inventions and scientists to continue bringing about these technological breakthroughs that our economy has really thrived on. And then we aren't supporting our working class industries, wages, hopefully reshoring, and having the population to, really bring back our manufacturing class that also produced the success of our economy in decades before. And then we also have sanctions, but they're not really enforced. And it just sort of feels like we aren't competing. We're waiting for the competition to go away almost. So I'm curious what you think is really stopping the U.S. government from actually approaching this as a whole of society effort versus just policies and conversations around Washington, particularly when we compare that to the way that China's approaching it, how they're pushing tons of funds into R&D. Every university has a new AI center. It just feels like there's a really big difference between what we want to achieve and the problems in society that are needed to actually get there.
Thanks. So I think when we talk about technology competition, we have to acknowledge right at the beginning that the way each of our systems approaches this is going to be different because we have very different political systems, very different systems of political economy. And as you alluded to, the PRC system sets out goals over a 10 to 15-year timeline. Think of Made in China 2025, which was an effort to basically indigenize a majority percentage of a whole range of key technologies into China by the year 2025, which, lo and behold, we're now in. This was rolled out about 15 years ago. And the ability of the U.S. system to do that is totally different. It's not how our system is structured. And yet, today, the United States does remain ahead. Let's just take AI. And there are some domains where we have sort of come about equal. There are some domains where China is clearly in a stronger position, like solar manufacturing, let's say. I think, it seems to me like some of what you're calling for is a sort of a national effort to set aside maybe China, but to take AI really seriously, to really understand that this is a technology developing rapidly in real time around us, that in a couple of years there could be breakthroughs toward what is called artificial general intelligence, a kind of independently intelligent system that boggle the mind, and that the United States has not had a full conversation as a country about what that's going to mean. And I don't think anyone would say that we're 100% ready for that to come. But neither is China. And I think there's often a degree of confidence projected by Beijing in its ability to manage these kinds of developments that we've seen repeatedly is not necessarily matched by what actually happens. But I think the call for a much more serious and focused effort around these developments is right. I'm pretty pessimistic that we're going to get it in the current environment. And so I think then a real question for all of us to consider is, how do you shape what is essentially world-changing breakthroughs happening in private companies that often do not necessarily have to share a lot of what they're doing with anybody outside of the company, let alone with the U.S. government. The Biden administration did a series of executive orders on artificial intelligence that were an effort to try to begin to make some of that happen, but it's very unclear exactly how that'll go under this team.
I think we have time for one more question. Okay. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Cynthia. I'm with Civil Society. I worked with Ryan at the NSC last year. You mentioned earlier about the language barrier, so I wanted to ask, some people might know Xi Jinping and the Politburo's speeches in Chinese are very different from how they market it in English. And so, for example, Xi Jinping recently has been talking about 回归初心, which means return to your roots, which used to be a Buddhist saying, but he turned it political. And he essentially means he wants to return to Maoist roots of the Chinese Communist Party, which I find is obviously the timeline we are now is very different from back then. We're now at, I think, 3-child policy. The population is obviously in a decline, the economy questionable. How do you react to him saying that he wants to return to Maoism, and what does that mean for the United States? Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I think your first insight is an important one for everybody to be aware of, which is exactly as you say. Often there will be an English version and a Chinese version of the same speeches, and it's it's almost just a strange thing in 2025 when you have translation tools that can just do that for anybody, regardless of language skills. But I think it's not just an accident. It is also about, I think, very directly making the case that there is one message for the wider world, and there is one message for China domestically, and that those can be different, and that the world can know that they're different is actually, I think, not something that the CCP is too worried about. Kind of like the idea that they can be known to speak to these different audiences and different voices. To your specific question, that phrase and versions of that phrase have cropped up for a period of time. And I remember a moment when there was some sort of Chinese on the internet in China, some even mockery of what did it mean. In particular, where in Shanghai, where the CCP was established, that venue in central Shanghai, where there were signs saying this and people with T-shirts saying this with their hammer and sickle emblazoned onto it as well. This is, of course, T-shirt that they bought on the private market, probably not necessarily something that was handed out by party headquarters, with the, Hermes and Louboutin stores right there. And those contradictions are, I think, a part of contemporary China no matter what. To me, the appeals to original mission, to origins, to this history are first a reminder that Xi Jinping wants the Chinese people to see that first part of the history of the People's Republic of China, the 40s, 50s, 60s, not as a time to be embarrassed about, which perhaps their parents' generation sort of thought was the implication of reform and opening, but as a time to be somewhat proud of. He always talks about the effort to create rockets and the nuclear bomb in that period, as a kind of a reminder that in that time China was able, despite being isolated from the world, despite tremendous pressure, despite the split with the Soviet Union and bad relations with the United States and many others, to make these kinds of breakthroughs. So he wants to remind people of that. And then second, I think also there is a sense that Maoism in this use is not really just about kind of socialist ideas in the traditional sense, but is about what Xi Jinping likes to describe as a spirit of struggle, the ability to, eat bitterness, to suffer and to, persist, and those qualities of those earlier generations that had extremely difficult lives to live through. By the way, sometimes because of the Maoism, not just strengthened by it or whatever. But I think that is very much what that kind of language is designed to make people think of. Questionable to me whether it works, because I also think a lot of people have the capacity to see right through that, but I think that's the intention.
I think I want to give you a chance to maybe sign some books,
Sure.
but I thought maybe we would just end by seeing if you wanted to read one of your poems from your book.
Okay.
Your
I'll keep
Place,
it
My
quick.
Flag.
I'll keep it quick.
If you want, you can say a little something about it, or you could just read.
Sure. Okay. So I will read a short poem, which I wrote very loosely, inspired by and thinking about the great Chinese poet Liu Xiaobo, who also obviously was a activist and political thinker, and his wife Liu Xia. And the poem is imaginative. It is not literal, but I'll just read it briefly. It's called Spend. Spend. 7 years inside, no visitors, and 4 hours traveling north for 1 hour per month with him. No more, no phone calls, 4 men watching always, just not the man you want. Last fall, the fruit trees in the courtyard refused to ripen. In her verses, there are no sounds, none. Spend a month between chair and bed without sleep, then 2, 3, 4, 5, catch the infection from that skinny guard. Now it won't shake. In my eyes, he has always been and will always be an awkward, diligent poet. That summer of crackdown nearly 30 years ago, I bought a bag of apples. One's malformed, a second head, almost a second whole self inside, pushing out, skin bulging near breaking. Travel 4 hours north for 1 hour per month with him, no more, never. 4 men watching, always, just not the man you want. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us.